This video initially started out as a video about facial recognition and new laws around it, but it's quickly turned into a rabbit hole about the issues of bureaucracy, corruption, specifically in Ireland, and about the use of technology in order to control people. Might be a little bit different to the videos I usually put out, but it's still on topic to how technology affects us and how it's used in society. Ireland was once again in the media because of some of the riots that were happening up in Dublin. Now, despite my namesake, I'm not actually in favour of riots in any way. Just like most other riots, there was a small amount of people that were protesting for actual political means, or I shouldn't even say protesting, but rioting because of political reasons. The rest of them were really just people just looking for a few gibs and to maybe loot a few restaurants and stuff like that, but besides them, very few people were actually doing it for political reasons. But despite that, it's important to understand why it happened in the first place and what caused the riots. This is no longer really news as it happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but for those of you who don't know, 3 children and 2 adults were stabbed outside of a primary school. As of making this video, the one girl who's 5 years old is still in intensive care in the hospital. I really do hope that she makes a full recovery because this is the kind of thing that just does not happen in Ireland. I even tried to do a little bit of research to see if anyone has ever stabbed a load of children in broad daylight before, but it's just, there's no recorded cases of anything like this ever happening in Ireland. The person who did it was an Algerian native. We don't really know any real information about him besides his background on why he was an asylum seeker in Ireland in the first place. But this is partially due to the media deliberately leaving out details and not wanting to publish the person's national identity. There are many reasons they've given for doing this, such as not wanting to stoke the flames and cause more outrage or whatever like that, but realistically it's probably just because they're trying to push their narrative. As you can imagine, this case caused absolute outrage amongst people, and the media's handling of the case itself didn't really do them any favours. There's already previously been a good deal of protests over asylum process in Ireland, so something like this to happen really rubbed people the wrong way. Before we discuss the government and the media's response to what happened, it's important to actually take a slight detour to talk about the asylum process in Ireland. So if you come to Ireland and need a work permit, you pretty much get the same restrictions that you would in any other country. You could see this in the process to America or Canada or Australia, any other country. Unless you're an EU resident or you're inside the EEA, then you're pretty much going to need a work visa in order to come here and live here, for longer than 90 days anyway. There are some exceptions to this, for example, if you're a nurse or any other critical skill that's in low demand, but the immigration process is pretty similar to every other country really. The main issue arises with the asylum process in Ireland. So just like every other country that's following the Geneva Convention, we need to process anyone who comes in and claims asylum into the country. However, this has caused a lot of issues, specifically because of the number of people who came in to claim asylum, and also because the government's attitude towards it and the backdraft of people coming in. The process of actually verifying the asylum status of someone who comes in and claims it takes a long time normally. It usually takes about 5 months in order to even get past the second stage. When you initially come into the country, you go into the customs or whatever desk is available and you say that you want to claim asylum. After that, there's a brief interview where they take down some details such as your name, where you've came from, and the reason for claiming international protection or asylum. So after the first interview, you're normally held in a direct provision centre or some other custody for a while until you can go for the second interview. This is where they do the research and they check all your details to make sure that your asylum process is actually valid. If after this second interview they determine that you do not qualify for asylum, you can actually appease the decision. If your appeal gets refused, either you or your solicitor can appeal to the Justice Minister. Even if the Justice Minister herself refuses your application, then you can still appeal that decision to the IPAT. So as you can see, there's a lot of different stages in this process to which you can appeal, and each one of these takes a long period of time. After 5 months of being in the country, you can just apply for a work permit and just continue living on, although there's a large restriction as to what you can and can't do. Because of this reason and because it's so open the government has been towards asylum seekers, a lot of people have used this in order to gain the system. This isn't just hearsay either. When you take a look at the statistics, you can see that there's large amounts of people that have come the last few years, and the vast majority of them have had their applications rejected, as you can see in red here, as opposed to the greens are the people that have been accepted. And what's even worrying is that the numbers don't actually add up when you look at the accepted and rejected, which means that a large amount of people are just still in the system, waiting for their application to be seen through. Certain countries that are quite clearly in war, such as Afghanistan and Ukraine, have a higher rate of people coming in, but the vast majority of applicants just do not qualify for international protection, and this is just clear. And despite this, if someone has been ordered a deportation order because their application was rejected, a lot of them just don't get fulfilled. The reason this has become such a hot button topic is because the person who stabbed those children a few weeks ago, they were actually ordered 2 deportation orders before, but due to NGOs and other people appealing the decisions, they were actually allowed to stay in the country. Although this is a hot button topic in a lot of other countries as well, it's particularly bad in Ireland considering how large our country is compared to others. Although Ireland does have a large amount of money due to large multinational corporations in our country, what we don't have a lot of is land and resources such as housing. And as the cost of living crisis has really affected this country, and stuff like this really puts more pressure on the system, not taking into account stuff like primary schools, roads, hospitals, and everything else in between. Douglas Murray from the UK once said that if we don't have a genuine discussion about the issues of immigration, then the conversation is going to be dictated by people who are the precise kinds of people that you do not want to have that conversation with, primarily people who are doing it for bigoted reasons. Now, you would imagine with such a horrible stabbing attack to happen, and the first time this ever happening in Irish history, you'd imagine that that's all that the media would be talking about. But after the riots that happened, pretty much every single newspaper bar 1 or 2, all they talked about was the riots and how horrible they were. Now, although the riots were very disruptive for Dublin businesses, and they were probably one of the most violent outbreaks to happen in recent memory anyway. I mean, I wouldn't quite put it on terms with what happened in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, but they were pretty bad. But despite that, no one was murdered during the riots. No one was seriously injured in the same way that they were during the stabbing attacks. So it's a bit weird that every single media outlet focuses on this instead of the horrible stabbing attack that happened. And make no mistake, the riots were primarily focused on the issues of asylum seeking and immigration in general. So the week that this happened in Ireland, the government decided to go into full-on damage control mode, and they decided to push down the hate speech legislation that they were trying to bring in before. This legislation means that any use of hateful speech, whatever the fuck that means, can now be punishable by either fines or even jail time in certain cases. I mean, the details of it haven't been brought in yet because there's been large opposition for this for obvious reasons. It's a crackdown on free speech. It is very similar to the Communications Act that was brought in the UK. Some people have claimed that it's pretty much a carbon copy of what they brought in. This legislation in the UK before has been used to punish people for telling edgy jokes, and even in some cases for calling certain politicians Nazis, which is interesting. And the more interesting topic, and one that I've covered before in a previous video, is that they've now published a draft law for the facial recognition technology bill. In a previous video I discussed this, and you should check that out on my channel if you want. But essentially the Justice Minister tried to get this introduced so that police could use facial recognition technology along with body cameras that they were wearing on their persons. Well, apparently due to the Dublin Riots, they're now trying to bring this in full force again. Now you might ask yourself, why would they need to introduce this at all? I mean, after all, the rioters were all covering their faces up, they were all going out during dark. How exactly would facial recognition be a perfect application in this? Well, I suppose we don't have to worry because they claim that it's only going to be used during certain serious crimes such as murder or rape, for example. It's hard to understand exactly why they're bringing it in now and why the Dublin riots were used as a reason for bringing it in the first place if they're only going to bring it in for serious crimes. This kind of logic just doesn't make any fucking sense if you put it under the least bit of scrutiny. None of this makes any sense, but it's not supposed to make sense. They're just trying to get it through the bill. The difference between facial recognition and other biometric data is that your face is actually being sampled without your consent. Having your face revealed in public is almost a part of a social contract. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, covering your face is almost considered incriminating in and of itself. And with the advancements of facial recognition technology, it's pretty clear that they're trying to just use this as a form of social control, as opposed to actually doing it for serious crimes like they claim. I've long since talked about the issues of using facial recognition, as well as other forms of surveillance such as gait recognition, which is essentially just being able to identify people based on the way they walk. And when you consider the context of people being potentially arrested and locked up because of stuff that they say online, then this becomes a lot more crazy. This is to say that even though this hasn't really been passed through Irish law at the moment, it's certainly being used in other countries such as the UK and the US. But even then, there's so many different markers and so many different ways that the police can essentially identify you during protests. Everything from your cell network to the Wi-Fi that you're connected to can be used to identify you based on your phone. Certain stuff like checkpoints that you've driven through can be used to identify your cars. And again, biometric markers such as your face, your way you walk, or even tattoos that you've gotten can be used to identify you after protests. There's a great article that has been made by the EFF. I'd really recommend that you take a look through it. Basically just all different aspects of how you can protect yourself during a protest. Using full encryption on your phone, which is done on Android and iOS already by default. Making sure you use a secure and private OS such as Graphene or Calyx OS. You can look at tutorials on my channel for how to actually set that up on your Pixel phone if you want. I would highly recommend it because not only do you get 3 times the amount of battery life, but you don't have to worry about Google or any other tech company spying on you. Stuff like biometric markers, which can be used to essentially just open your phone without your consent anyway. And of course using more secure apps such as Signal or Briar or other communication applications. And this might seem like such an overreaction and this might seem absolutely crazy, but this kind of thing has been used in other countries before in order to stop protesters. But even outside of super strict countries like China, this has been happening in the UK and the US forever. In the US, certain police officers have been known to go through crowds with a bag containing a access point for Wi-Fi so that phones connect to them automatically. This can allow them to gather IDs and be able to identify them in the future. It's actually insane the amount of effort that police will go through in order to try and identify people just going to peaceful protests. And it makes you wonder if they're not trying to go after people for peacefully protesting, then why are they going through such lengths in order to gather identifiable data about them? Talking about certain topics are now going to be punishable by law, so of course these are going to be issues in the future. In the UK, the Just Stop Oil protests, which are a particularly horrible group of people, due to them protesting and blocking roads and stuff so hospitals and ambulances can't even get through, they've started to bring in new legislation in order to crack down on protests. A lot of people have even theorized that these people are being influenced or paid to do this so that they can bring in more draconian laws, but that's a bit outside of my wheelhouse. The point of this entire thing is that there are clearly some issues in Ireland at the moment, as with every other country, and these are becoming dangerous times. Technology and artificial intelligence in general is being used more and more in order to influence people to a certain viewpoint that can be seen on social media every day. But it's also being used in order to crack down on people and to stop them from being able to protest or express themselves. In the UK, protests are now becoming more restricted and people don't actually have the right to free assembly at the moment. And most people will point at the likes of Just Stop Oil or the far right or whatever and say that because these are bad people, they should be stopped. Well, that's all well and good until there's a cause that affects you and you can no longer assemble peacefully and protest over it because they've cracked down on it. I definitely follow the advice of the EFF and be careful when protesting any cause. But yeah, that's it, and until then, I'll see you next time.